And thank you so much for joining us. And I really appreciate all of the time that you're giving us today to talk about you and also your book, Everybody's Son, that we've been focusing on for the library's community read. You've had a very interesting life. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started as a writer and how you
Oh
chose
boy,
that as a profession?
that's a tall order. Tell you about my life. Well, first of all, let me just thank you personally, Denny, and let me thank Lima Public Library for hosting this event and for selecting Everybody's Son as the one community read book. I'm deeply grateful to the community for this and to the library, obviously. Okay, so where do I start? Well, I'll start by telling you that I came to this country when I was 21 years old. I grew up in Bombay, India, and came to Ohio State to get a master's in journalism, which I did. And after that, the plan had always been was to spend 2 years getting my master's and then going home. And one thing led to another, and I never really went back home again and settled in this country, worked for a long time at the Akron Beacon Journal. While I was there, decided to get a PhD in English Lit, just wanted to read great books, but with some guidance that professors can give you. And ended up going to Kent State part-time while I was working full-time still at the Beacon. Not an ideal way in which to get a degree, but it was the only way I could afford to do it. So that's what I did. I got done with that. While all this was going on, I was also writing what eventually, many years later, ended up being my first novel, and that's called Bombay Time. But it just got too difficult to juggle working full time, going to school in the evenings, trying to write a dissertation, and trying to write a novel. So it was just too much. Life got too crazy. I put the novel away for a few years. And then while I was at the Beacon, I saw a sign on the bulletin board that said, apply for something known as the Nieman Fellowship. And the Nieman Fellowship, as I've often said, is God's gift to journalism. I mean, basically, if you get in, they allow you a year of free study at Harvard University. And you pretty much, set your own curriculum. You take whatever classes interest you. My dissertation was in African American literature, so I took a lot of classes with the likes of Skip Gates, etc., Cornell West, talking about issues of race and racism and that kind of thing. And while I was there, my secret plan, which I had not shared with anyone, was to look at that novel that I had started and never finished, look at it again and see if there was anything there. So that's what I did. I would get up 5 a.m., work for 3 or 4 hours, shower, go to school the whole day. And that was life for a year. While I was still at Harvard, I accidentally ran into this woman who approached me and said, I'm an agent. Are you by any chance working on anything? And I just felt like an angel had dropped from the heavens, because if you talk to writers, this kind of good luck just never happens, So by the time I returned back to Ohio at the end of the year, not only did I have an agent, I actually had a publishing contract. And that, in a nutshell, is how my sort of transition from nonfiction, which is what journalism is, to writing fiction and now writing children's picture books, that was sort of the beginning of it. So on one hand, it feels like it all happened very quickly during that year, but there were a lot of years leading up to that 1 year, which is often true for people.
What led you to choose Ohio State to study at?
Well, I was just telling a friend recently that I'm the kind of person who agonizes about, should I spend, $20 buying this book or that book or this CD or that CD. But when it comes to the really major decisions in my life, I make them on an impulse. It's just how I'm built. So picture me at age 20 not knowing nothing about nothing, um, sitting in my living room in Bombay, listening to music. And just earlier that day, I had gone to the US Embassy, and then this is pre-internet, so they used to give you paper copies of universities in the US that offered the programs that you were interested in. So I had that sheet, several pages in my hand, and I was just sort of glancing at it, looking for things that sounded familiar. I remember applying to Columbia University because that I did know they had a very good journalism program. I applied to some place in California, I remember, just because it was California, and I just decided I needed a third choice. I had no idea what that third choice should be. And the music I was listening to was an album by the folk singer Joan Baez. And Joan sings a song called Banks of the Ohio. And that song came on, the player, and right then my eyes fell on Ohio State. And I looked up to the heavens and I said, it's a sign, And I sent them my $50 check. And next thing I know, I got a letter in the mail saying, you're in. So it was for the most ridiculous of reasons that I stumbled upon Ohio, you could say. But I just found wherever I've lived in Ohio, I've just found it to be such a wonderful community, such a welcoming community. And there are times, you always wonder about the road not taken, Mm-hmm. And I do wonder, on a day like today when it's snowing outside, it would be great if I'd ended up in California. And I'm a big city person, so New York, which is where Columbia is, would have been great too. But I have to say that the life that I've been able to build for myself here, and the friends, the community of friends that really are like family to me here, I don't think I could have done that anywhere else.
It sounds like you make a lot of decisions for your life, or things happen just fortuitously or by fate. Do you build that into your novels for your characters?
It's really funny. I think not. Although you're absolutely right, and it's a smart observation, and one that after we get done with this event, I'll probably spend some time thinking about. I do think that in my life, a lot of things have happened, as you call it, because of fate. And yet, when I read novels in which there are coincidences, where somebody who hasn't seen somebody in 25 years runs into them at the supermarket just randomly, as a reader, I shy away from books like that. I kind of find myself rolling my eyes and thinking, really? I mean, this is the best you could do? You couldn't come up with a plot development that's, tougher than that? So it's interesting. I mean, clearly, like the story I just told you about that agent approaching me at the end of a book reading, a poetry reading that I attended for somebody else, right? Based on a question that I asked the speaker during the Q&A, and believe me, it was no great shakes, that question. There was nothing like particularly smart about that question, So I guess that is a kind of coincidence or a kind of fate putting down its calling card, And yet I don't think, I could be wrong, I'm not thinking about all my books right now, but I don't think that fate features as a characteristic so very much, or certainly not coincidence, in my novels. Because I think in my books, I'm so much more interested in character development. I'm so much more focused on how my characters are going to behave and interact with each other on the page. That, yeah.
So you've been a writer for a while. You've published a number of novels. You said you got your start from this agent who approached you. How long between that point and, now, where did you consider yourself, I've made it, I'm successful as a writer?
Hasn't happened yet, and I think if you talk to 10 writers, at least 9 of them will give you the same answer. I think the insecurity and the sort of perhaps even sometimes the negative messaging that you give yourself. I don't know why, but it seems to be part and parcel of being a writer. I certainly don't feel any sense of like, oh, I've made it, not at all. I mean, I feel like I'm just as good as my last book. And just because I have a publishing contract for one book, there is absolutely no guarantee. And that's part of it is just the nature of the toughness of the business. There's absolutely no guarantee. I know somebody who had a beautiful novel that was published on 9/11, 2001. And you can imagine what happened to that novel. I mean, it was like nobody was thinking of novels, for months after that. And it kind of disappeared. There's just so much that we cannot control as writers. Um, so, this is why when younger writers ask me for advice, my best possible advice is focus on the writing, because that's why you got into the business in the first place. Focus on what makes you happy and set the whole marketing and the publishing and that aspect, just set it aside, because that is nothing you can control, you know. But revision, editing, writing the most perfect sentence that you possibly can, that's you. You have control over that, at least to some extent.
One of our attendees asks, how did your family feel about you coming to the US as a young person? And I would extend that and include, how did they feel about you choosing writing as a career?
They weren't very thrilled about either decision for a long time, to be honest with you. So my dad had a business in India, and he had always hoped that I would succeed him in that business. And I had absolutely no head for figures or money or business. I was just one of those goofy, head in the clouds kind of a kid. And it even at that young age, it used to surprise me that my father, who knew me very well, I mean, we were close friends, I would say. We loved each other very much. He didn't know that about me. He didn't realize what a disaster I would have been if I had actually taken over the family business. So all through my teenage years, and look, I grew up in a middle class, perhaps even upper middle class family. Um, and it was the kind of family where we subscribed to 3 newspapers a day. But it was not the kind of family where where there were tickets to the ballet on the coffee table or a stack of books. Wasn't like that. Inspirational family. My father, just through his efforts, was trying up the so there was no frame of reference for me to say I wanted to be a poet or I wanted to be a fiction writer. It was just there was nothing in our immediate community or surroundings that would have supported that. So I started going around saying the next best thing, which is I wanted to be a journalist. Um, because at least with journalism, there's some prospect of a job and a paycheck and all the things that parents worry about in their kids. But even that, he was not happy about that anymore. But then as time went by, and he realized that I really did want to come to the US to get a graduate degree in journalism, that I was really serious about learning the craft of writing, he relented and he gave in. But he most certainly expected me, to come home after I got done. I did too. But when he realized that, this country, for whatever reason, just fitted me, it from the very get-go, like I was happy here, you know. And once he realized that, he gave me his blessings.
So you've written both nonfiction and fiction. Have you ever written something that featured, a person from your own background or a friend that they've read themselves in your work, and how did they react to it?
Not really. I know that many writers do that, and I know personally of cases where it's posed great problems within a family or with a friend where they recognize themselves in a book. Uh, I don't know that I've deliberately avoided doing that. I have certainly used stories that I've heard told to me by a friend about somebody that I don't know personally. My very first novel, Bombay Time, I had this character who's like this old, crusty woman who's like the neighborhood gossip. She's somebody that the unhappy housewives of the neighborhood come to seeking marital advice and how to how to discipline their kids, that kind of stuff. She's not a very likable character. Um, and I realized that she was very one dimensional the way I had her. And I had heard a story about a much older friend's older sister in Bombay, maybe a full 10 years before I wrote that book. And I had not spent much time really thinking about that story. But when I was thinking of how to give this character of Dosamai, more dimensions, how to give her a backstory, this entire story came back to me. And I borrowed heavily from it. Um, and I think I was successful in giving Dosamai, you know, um, some understanding to the reader as to why she turned out the way she did. But that's about the extent to which I borrow from other people's lives.
For Everybody's Son, what prompted you to tell Anton's story? And kind of an extension of that, the world that you've created in Everybody's Son differs from your own background. So how did you authentically craft those characters who have such different backgrounds from you, and how did that kind of impact your writing and style? And
I'll tell you that the origin point of Everybody's Son was and remains a mystery to me. I was just going about my own business one day when, within a span of about 30 seconds, the entire story presented itself to me. I mean, I knew the last sentence and I knew the first sentence. I knew all the major characters. The story even presented itself to me with the names attached. Like I never, Anton was never Bob earlier. He was his mom, the stepfather, all of them. The whole story came to me home. That has never happened before. It has never happened since. And I almost didn't trust it for a few days. I almost thought, this is borrowed. Maybe I've gotten this from someplace else. This doesn't sound right to me. But I just kept seeing these characters in their entirety. I mean, I knew what Anton looked like. I knew what his mom looked like, all of that. There was that issue about the fact that there were no Indian characters in this novel at all. I was writing about a white couple, and I was writing about a black son and his mom. Because I teach African American lit, and that was my field of study too, and I'm certainly very interested in African American history. I felt enough sense of confidence that if I bungled up, I wouldn't bungle up any worse than I would in any of my other novels. That I could approach this topic with sensitivity and with a sense of respect. I guess one of the features of many of my books is that people have commented on in the past is I don't like writing simple characters. None of my characters are just good or just bad, because that just doesn't create for interesting literature, nor is it representative of how human beings are built. So I tried to give the flawed characters humanity. I guess that's the key word here, humanity. I felt that as long as I didn't lose touch with any of their humanities, including the white stepdad, who does something pretty horrific uh, because he loses his heart to this young boy. Um, I wanted to complicate even his ethical lapse to the point where there are no easy answers about whether he did the right thing or not. And that's most certainly true for all the other major characters.
It's definitely what's made the book so discussable for us. So thank you for that. One of our attendees asks, so if the stories don't normally present themselves to you whole as they did for Everybody's Son, can you talk about how you do get inspiration for your stories, and how do you go about crafting those characters that don't come to you whole? And do you take any trips for research for anything? What's that process look like?
Um, I think every book has a slightly different origin point. Um, some books literally come to you with an opening line, and you have no idea what that line means until you spend time thinking about it. Some come with the plot. I have this one novel called The Weight of Heaven, which tells the story of this young white American couple who lose their son, 7-year-old son, Benny, to a sudden illness. And they are just totally lost. And as a way of sort of reclaiming their marriage and saving their lives, the father, the husband, accepts a job posting in this very small village, fictional village in India. Takes this job thinking that a change of scenery would help him and his wife, and complications ensue, after they are there. That story came to me as a short story. I was homesick. I had a very high fever. I had gone to bed during the day. I woke up at about 4 p.m. And like almost in that kind of feverish state, made my way to my computer and wrote out this 20-page short story in one sitting. At that time, I used to belong to this writers group. I shared the story with them, and one of the members of that group said, I really like the story, but I want to know more about these people. I would read a whole novel based on these characters. And I thought to myself, yeah, I think I can do that. There's so much more I want to say, because it's a story about sort of a kind of cultural imperialism, kind of quasi-colonial attitudes, just so much more than what you can accommodate in a short story. So that story had that as an origin point. So really, they all come from a different place. And when they do come, you're just grateful.
It's interesting that you mentioned The Weight of Heaven, because I had written down that these two stories actually share some very broad similarities. A couple who has lost their son and taking on another child to care for as their own. Was that intentional? I want to say that The Weight of Heaven was written quite a few years before Everybody's Son.
Right. Not at all intentional. And to prove to you once again how much smarter readers are than writers are, I don't think it once occurred to me while I was writing Everybody's Son that it shared some of the DNA of Weight of Heaven. It just felt so different to me. And yet I can easily now that both books are out in the world, I can see the parallels, and I can see how some of the themes, etc., are very similar.
So one thing that I did want to ask was, for readers, do you have any suggestions of what they do or what you wish they would do either before or after they experience one of your stories? Do you, wish that they brushed up on reading about India before they picked up one of your books or another topic, or even explored afterwards?
I don't feel like it's my place really to tell a reader how they should spend their days or their lives, or I would say having a good meal always helps, No, but I mean, really, all I would say is just keep reading. You know, read books by other writers. Maybe please read some of my other books. You know, but if you're a reader, it's like this endless, lifelong journey, right? I mean, you'll never run out of great books to read. So yeah, that's about it. I don't think you have to be an expert on India in order to enjoy. I hope not. I mean, I hope that even though I might occasionally write about a very specific place, you know, that there's something about, thematically, there's something about the book that speaks to human behavior, you know. That is ultimately every writer's hope. You know, even if you're writing about space, even if your books are set, you know, 2,000 years from now, you know, you still, as a writer, you still want something recognizably human and universal to come through, right? And if that happens, you've done your job, I think.
I ask every author that I meet that, or a variation of that question, because I got into a very heated debate with one of my English professors about the intent of the author and having their readers kind of get very granular with the meaning of their stories. And I was adamant that the author did not care that much about, you know, what a reader would take away from this story. And we eventually agreed to disagree, but I like to bring it up. If you were to have written Everybody's Son kind of post 9/11, or set it more today, so just after maybe George Floyd, how do you think that would have changed your story? Have we made progress as a society to have changed elements, or would it be roughly the same?
It's a tough question to answer. And frankly, it's a good question because I ask myself a lot of the same question, you know, like what actually came out of last year's turmoil and protests that were genuinely multiracial and diverse in nature, you know? You know, so we toppled a few Confederate statues, and we are renaming some teams, all of which is good. But have we made any kind of genuine difference in the lives of people? You know, the figure that haunts me a great deal is that for every $100 of wealth, I'm not talking about income, there's a difference, right? So for every $100 of wealth in a white family, a black family has $10, right? That it's that big a gap. And in some ways, the wealth gap is wider than it was before the civil rights movement. I mean, those are horrific figures, right? And I'm somebody who thinks, you know, improve people's material lives, and it's not like racism will just disappear if you narrow that gap or eliminate that gap, but it'll help, right? So in that sense, I'm not sure concretely on the ground, you know, what has changed. But of late, I'm finding myself thinking the kind of active, you know, we now have a president who's actually using the words white supremacy, who's actually talking about racial injustice and how that is a pressing issue, not just for brown Americans or black Americans. It's an issue for all of us, right? Because that's the nature of oppression. Oppression never only oppresses the oppressed, it also oppresses the oppressor, right? So I think if there is any change at all, I mean, look at Joe Biden's cabinet. It is the most diverse we have ever seen. Would that have happened without everything that happened last year? I'm not sure that it would have, you know? And even that, if it just remains a symbolic change, you know, now we have 50% of the cabinet that looks like America, it's not good enough, right? All those people who are in that cabinet now have to continually advocate for a better country, right? So I guess I guess I would answer your question in a nutshell by saying to be continued, dot, dot, dot. We don't know the answer yet.
That's probably a good way to put it. And speaking of which, so you've written Everybody's Son kind of at focal points in Anton's life, the different phases. After the story ends, what did you envision for the rest of his life?
I think, without giving too much away, I think what Anton, because of what has happened to him at a young age, what he's missing is that sense of unification, um, of integration, of self. And my best hope for Anton is that now that a new path has opened up for him, he is wise enough and smart enough to know that he needs all these elements in order to be successful, you know, and that he figures out a way of embracing this new way that he has discovered by the end of the book and incorporating that into his life. If he once again slams the door shut on that, I think he still remains the kind of half-formed man that he is throughout the book. If he rejects his family, you know, his the people who have adopted him, I think there is still a part of him that'll be missing because they too have shaped his bones, you know. And I think it's perfectly fine for human beings to have multiple fathers and mothers. You know, I think it's dangerous. I mean, I come from a culture where the concept of the joint family is still very prevalent, you know. It does take a village to raise a child. I believe that. And Anton is lucky enough to have a shot at that, you know. So that's my hope for him.
You've written other sequels. Will there ever be a sequel for Everybody's Son?
You know, the one thing, I had to eat a bit of humble pie recently because people, when Space Between Us came out all those years ago, you know, over the years, people asked and asked and asked for a sequel. And I never even took it seriously. I just always thought, yeah, it's just a nice thing for people to say, you know, but, and then one day, you know, a few years ago, I suddenly saw this character of Parvati, who's this very, very small, almost inconsequential character in the original, in The Space Between Us. And I thought, you know, there's so much I could do with her. And then I got excited at the thought of that. And I thought, if I took Parvati and if I introduced her to Bhima, who's the other main character from the original book, I bet they would have, you know, these are two marginalized women, getting old women on sort of the edges of life. If I could introduce them to one another, I bet they would have some great stuff to say to one another. And that's how the sequel came about, you know. So it wasn't what readers were asking for. It wasn't a simple retelling of the same story twice, which I had no interest in doing, but it was a way of taking the book in a different direction. So if I can ever think of a way to do that with any of my books, I think at this point in my life, I would say yes.
So I know that for many authors, one of the most difficult parts of the process of writing a story is editing. And I think you said that earlier. What parts of Everybody's Son didn't make it into the final cut? What was left on the editing room floor?
I don't think I could tell you. I just don't remember. I mean, I can, you know, it's just been too many years ago and it's so organic. You know, I edit while I'm still writing too, because every day when I sit at my desk to start a new section or a new chapter, I always spend a few minutes going over what I've written the day before. So, you know, in other words, by the time the first draft of the book gets done, in some sense, it's already the second draft, you know. So it's very difficult for me to say what got left behind.
Um, What other authors or stories would you recommend to people who enjoy your own works?
Um, I read a book recently called A Place for Us. It's a debut novel by this young Indian American writer that I just thought was stunning. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book. Always, I should have this at my fingertips, and I just blank out when I'm asked. I mean, there's just so many wonderful books. I'm currently, for some other event that I'm going to do with a different library system, with the Cuyahoga County Library System next month. It's called The Battle of the Books, I think. I'm rereading a book that I've always loved, and it's Gloria Naylor's Mama Day. It's not, everybody knows the women of Brewster Place, but not everybody knows of Mama Day. And I just think, I mean, just in terms of the sheer humanity of the book, it's just a glorious book. So I would say, by all means, read African American writers. One of the things I love about African American literature is that I feel like people like Morrison and Naylor and Alice Walker, they really wrote with an eye on history. They weren't just writing about middle class suburban life. They were writing about really, really deep, meaningful, powerful stuff. And as a reader, I just respond to that kind of writing a great deal.
And recently you've been making the transition to a children's author. How is it different for you to write for an adult audience versus a children's audience?
So the only books I've written 3 books, and they're all picture books, right? So I guess I can say 2 things about that, about the differences. One is, it feels very much, when you write a picture book, it feels like you're writing poetry. And, a lifetime ago, when I first started writing, I was not a fiction writer. I mean, I wrote a short story here and there, but I mostly wrote poetry, and then I moved away from it completely. So when I write picture books, it feels to me, it has the same, language has to be really, really precise and brief. Sometimes there's a refrain. It has more of the elements of poetry than necessarily fiction. So I enjoy that very much. And the other thing, of course, is when you do a picture book, you're collaborating with another person, right? You give the words to an illustrator, and then they use their own life experience and their own talents and bring it to life. And that is amazing. I mean, when you write a novel, other than whoever designs at the publishing house, whoever designs the jacket, you don't have that kind of a collaboration. And so one of my books that came out this fall, it's called Sugar and Milk. And it's a beautifully, beautifully illustrated book. I mean, I almost feel like it's almost like an art book, rather than just a children's book. And it was illustrated by this young artist, I think she's going to be very, very big and famous, but a young woman in Vietnam, who I've never met. And the story of Sugar and Milk, it's a modern day retelling of an ancient Persian legend about immigration, about hospitality, about kindness. And so imagine how this works. Here I am sitting in Cleveland, Ohio, sending email after email to my wonderful editor in New York, telling her, these are the instructions, like this, tell Koa to look at, miniature Persian art. Tell her to stare at the intricacy of Oriental rugs. And I want that kind of richness and color and depth in those pages that deal with the flashback section that tells the ancient myth or folktale. And by golly, she delivered on all of it. The modern sections that are set in an unnamed city, which is mostly New York, are just so different than that middle section. And I just thought, isn't that I mean, isn't it a glorious time to be alive in the 21st century when an Indian American author can talk to her American um, publisher and editor to give instructions to a Vietnamese woman in Vietnam, and we all collaborate and create this product together.
It certainly makes for a more diverse, final product.
Right.
Is that something that you wish that you could do with your adult novels? Collaborate with people from different backgrounds?
Well, that's always the dream, right? I mean, it's. I just feel like there are two kinds of people on earth, those who shy away and are even afraid of diversity, and those who revel in it. And I think we all get to choose who we want to be in that regard. So whether it's in business and work or in daily life, I mean, I just feel like the more the merrier.
Well, I appreciate you answering all of my questions, but now I would like to open the floor up to any of our participants. If you have a question for Thrity, please put it into our chat box now, and I will ask it for you. We did have a message that does say your explanation of the effects of oppression on those being oppressed and those doing the oppressing is wonderful. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just waiting to see if any other questions come in. You'd answered all of mine so effectively and beautifully. So thank you. Are you working on any adult novels now?
Yeah, so I actually have a book that's coming out in January of next year, 2022. I had to think about that for a second. It's called Honor, and it tells the story of this Indian American journalist who has vowed, for reasons that we don't know, to never go back to India. And she's sort of roped into going there to cover, to take over a story that a American colleague was covering. And the story that she takes over is this young woman in a village in India who is suing her Hindu brothers for the death of her Muslim husband. And when I wrote the book a couple of years ago, I never imagined that the topic would become as relevant as it has, unfortunately, in India right now. There's a lot of stuff going on between Hindus and Muslims, and it's ugly stuff. And so that's the book that's coming out next year. And it's called Honor because the brothers who do the killing think that they are honoring, their families by doing this horrible deed. And it's just a misguided notion of what honor really is.
Well, that does tie into two of the questions we received actually are, have you been able to visit your family back in India recently? Do you do that often? Does that inspire your work?
Yeah, so I went back to India after a very long absence for one reason or the other. Just in 2020, I went in early January and came back at the end of the month. And then, of course, while I was there, everybody was blissfully unaware of this little pesky little thing called the coronavirus. And but soon after I came back, I feel like I went in the nick of time and got back in the nick of time. And I did go because I was doing research on another book. And the thing about a country like India, and especially a city like Bombay, is things are changing all the time. So I wanted to see for myself how the city, the landscape of the city itself was changing. But then, there's also things like language. I mean, you don't think of that often, but, different expressions gain currency, the idiom changes. So I just wanted to go there to be aware of all those things. And so that's what I did and got back just in the nick of time.
Yeah. We have another question that says, do you think the collaboration between those you mentioned, your publisher, illustrator, and yourself worked so well because you were all coming from the idea of what true humanity is for all of us?
It's a beautiful way of phrasing it. I'm not sure. I'll just be honest with you. You know, nobody was thinking in those noble terms. We were all just doing our jobs and doing, you know, the best job that we could. But I have to say that I dearly love the editor who, you know, loved Sugar and Milk, responded to the story. You know, she's a young mother in New York. I'm sorry, I keep saying New York. She's actually in Philadelphia. And you know, she just embraced the message of the book, not just because of who she is, but because as a young mother, she thought this was the kind of message that she wanted to impart to her own kids. And although I've never met Koya, the illustrator, I just get a sense that she is just a terrific human being also. So it's always nice when you can meet and work with people who you not just, you know, people that you respect, people of integrity.
And I think part of that is also where they are in their lives, as you're saying. Your editor was, you know, at a particular place where the story spoke to her, and that can be a real contributing factor in the creative process, I think. So yeah. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So I wanted to thank you again. This has been a wonderful opportunity for all of us to kind of get inside of the mind of an author that we've been enjoying for the past 2 months. So we really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend with us today and answering all of our questions.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you to all the people who have attended today. Appreciate it very much. Take care.
All right, I'm going to end this session. Thank you all.